Today we're talking about American democratic principles, the key ideas that animate our democracy, basic principles that we expect to be in place at every level of government, whether it's state, local, or national. These are things that we expect to see our government leaders live up to, and that we have an obligation as people and citizens to hold our leaders accountable for. The first principle that we're going to talk about is the idea of individual rights. If we think back to the social contract and what John Locke wrote, as well as thinking back to the Declaration of Independence, the idea of life, liberty, and property are paramount. The idea that government is established, according to the social contract, with the sole purpose of protecting these basic natural rights leads us to view individual rights and the protection of those rights as a core job of government, and it also leads us to respect the rights that other people have. One of my favorite quotations coming about free speech is, "I do not necessarily agree with what you say, but I defend to the death your right to say it." So these quotations, these ideas that I don't necessarily like that somebody has a right to smoke. It bothers me, I don't like it. But they have a right to do it if they want to. I don't like that people use guns. The Second Amendment says that people have a right to have guns. So we may be able to put some limitations on some of these rights, but those rights still exist, and we can't take them away. It's an example of why we have to allow protest marches, even if we disagree with the ideas that are being advocated by the protesters. All right. Individual rights. Secondly, popular sovereignty. This comes from the basic idea of what demos is, the idea that the people shall rule. In this country, people form the backbone of our democracy. That's you. You, your family members, your friends, everyone that you know in your community across this country is responsible for making this the best country that it can be. If you don't take those actions, if you don't step up and do your part, then we'll be weaker than we would be if you were actually getting involved. So popular sovereignty simply means sovereign is to rule, and popular is the people. So the people rule. So we have a system of rule by the people, and everybody collectively is in charge of and responsible for the decisions that are made in our country. Third basic principle is the idea of limited government. You can infer this idea from the need to respect individual rights and the recognition that the people are in charge. Government has a role, but we very strongly in this country believe that the role of government should be limited. We don't want an authoritarian government stretching out to control the decisions that I make inside my own home. I don't want the government saying what I can and cannot read, what I can and cannot eat. I don't want the government saying how I should conduct myself in my daily life. So we place limitations on government. The Constitution limits the power of government by dividing the powers among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. We also, in the Constitution, explicitly delegate some powers to the government, to the federal government. Other powers are not given to the federal government. And so there's an ongoing debate about to what extent the powers of government are limited. If government passes a new law about surveillance to prevent terrorism, there is a discussion that happens about whether that law is justified because of national security needs, or whether it violates basic freedoms and liberties and is an overstep of government power. So, limited government is a very important principle. And then we move down to the rule of law. This is pretty basic, the idea that the law applies to every single person. There's no one who's above the law. President Nixon had to step down and resign because of violations of the law after he got caught in the Watergate scandal. We do, of course, see famous people, celebrities, politicians, oftentimes getting away with things that we think others would not get away with. We also see people who have a good lawyer sometimes get away with a crime that we think that they're guilty of. People always talk about the O.J. Simpson case, the George Zimmerman case. These are cases where we might not think justice was done. But the basic principle is that no matter who you are, we are a nation of laws. Another way to put this, as we talk about the rule of law, is that it's not really the president and the members of Congress or judges that rule us. People rule. We are ruled by the laws. Now, the laws are made by our elected representatives. So, just the fact that someone is president right now doesn't make them our ruler. It makes them someone to whom we've given a tremendous responsibility for exercising the laws. The laws have to be followed. If we decide we don't like the laws, there are ways to change those laws, and we have to follow that process to get those laws modified. That's what happened in the Civil Rights Movement, when many people fought against unjust segregation laws and Jim Crow. Fifth example of a principle of democracy here is the equal protection of the law. This was added to the Constitution in the 14th Amendment. It was not originally a part of the Bill of Rights or originally a part of the Constitution. But we added it after the Civil War with the recognition that we needed to make sure that judges and all public officials apply the law equally and fairly to all people. This was a central aspect of the Supreme Court ruling in Brown v. Board of Education, which struck down segregated schools. And it meant that you could not treat black people and white people or Latino people or Asians differently based on the color of their skin. You can't treat men and women differently. You cannot treat anybody differently than anybody else under the law. So, individual rights, popular sovereignty, limited government, the rule of law, and equal protection are 5 core principles of American democracy. There are others that we can talk about, but these are some that you should be very familiar with.